You did not wake up one morning and decide to become a caregiver. That's not usually how it happens. Most people don't start with caregiving. Most people start with helping. Mom asks for a ride to an appointment. You help. Your dad gets confused by some paperwork. You help. A bill gets missed. You pay it. Somebody needs a reminder. You remind them. Nothing major, nothing dramatic, nothing that feels like caregiving. You're just being a good daughter, a loving son, a faithful spouse. You're helping somebody you care about. And then something else happens. And you help with that too. And something else. And before long, helping becomes normal. You don't really notice it because each individual step feels reasonable. Of course, you're going to drive her to the doctor. Of course, you'll help set up the medication. Of course, you'll make that phone call. Of course, you'll stop by and check on things. Of course, you'll handle the paperwork. Each decision makes sense, but eventually something changes. You realize you are no longer helping with someone's life. You're managing parts of it. You know more information they don't know. You remember more things they don't remember. You handle responsibilities they used to handle themselves. You solve problems they can no longer solve. And that's often the moment a caregiver loses perspective. Because the change happens so slowly, they never stopped to ask, what has actually changed here? Hey, Christian Care Companion. Welcome back to Dementia Caregiver Support for Christians, the podcast where we help you recognize the decision points caregiving creates and respond with biblical clarity and faithful stewardship. If you're wondering whether your caregiving situation has changed more than you realized, visit dignicarebydesign.com to determine whether your situation has reached a decision point. Now, here is what matters. The issue is not that you are doing more. The issue is that the responsibility has moved. Little by little, piece by piece. Responsibility that used to belong to one adult has gradually been transferred to another. Because the transfer happens so slowly, many caregivers keep thinking of the situation in the same way they did years before. And you think you're still just helping. But much of what you're carrying is no longer help. It's responsibility. It's oversight. It's management. It's supervision. It is stewardship of things another person can no longer reliably steward themselves. And here's where many Christian caregivers lose perspective. Because when responsibility transfers slowly, it doesn't feel like a major change. It feels like a series of small decisions. One phone call, one appointment, one reminder, one problem solved, one crisis avoided, one thing handled. Then another, and another, and another. The problem is that when these changes happen gradually, we adjust to it. We normalize it. We stop seeing it for what it is. You don't wake up every morning and compare today to 3 years ago. You compare today to yesterday. And yesterday looks pretty much the same as today. So the transfer of responsibility becomes invisible until someday someone asks you, how much are you actually doing? And you start to answer, well, I'm managing the medicines, I'm coordinating the appointments, I'm handling the finances, I'm monitoring their safety, I'm communicating with the rest of the family. I'm talking to the doctors. I'm solving some problems. I'm providing transportation. I'm managing the crisis. And then suddenly you realize something. This isn't occasional help anymore. This is caregiving. Now, here's what matters, because this is where many caregivers start solving for the wrong problem. They look at all of the individual issues. They look at the medication issue. They look at the driving issue. They look at the eating issue, the bathing issue, the wandering issue, the paperwork issue, the communication issue, and they try to solve them one at a time. But let me ask you a clarifying question. What if these aren't actually separate problems? What if they're all evidence of the same change? Here's what I see so often. A caregiver thinks the problem is that there are too many things going wrong, where the real issue is that the entire situation itself has changed. It's no longer a memory problem. It's no longer a paperwork problem. It's no longer an appointment problem. It's no longer a medication problem. Those things are real. They are real problems. But underneath them is something bigger. The responsibility has shifted. And because the responsibility has shifted, the requirements of what has to happen in that situation has changed. What used to require occasional involvement now requires ongoing oversight. What used to require reminders now requires management. What used to require assistance now requires supervision. What used to belong to one adult now depends on another. And guess what? That's the change. And when caregivers lose perspective, they often miss that change. They try to improve the old way of doing things, the old system. They try to become more efficient, maybe more organized, more available, more helpful. And eventually you reach a point where doing more is no longer solving the problem, because the problem isn't effort. The problem is that the entire structure underneath the situation has not changed, even though the requirements of the situation have. The situation is asking you to do something different now. And that is what many caregivers fail to recognize. Not because you're not paying attention, but because you've been faithfully adapting for so long that you no longer see how much has actually changed. So what has actually changed? Because that's the question. Not what happened yesterday, not what happened at the doctor's office, not what happened with the medicine. What changed? And this is what I want you to notice. For a long time, your loved one could still carry the responsibility for their own life. Maybe imperfectly, maybe with your help, but they could still do it. They could manage their appointments, manage their money, take their medicines, make decisions, solve problems, recover from making a mistake, function as an independent adult, and something started to change. Not all at once, a little by little. Responsibility after another became less reliable. You started checking, reminding, overseeing, then managing, then taking over. And eventually something important happened. The situation stopped depending on them and depending primarily on you. That's the shift. The person may still live in the same house. They may still recognize your name. They can still hold conversations. They are the same person, but the responsibility of the structure has changed. More and more of daily life now works only because someone else is carrying it. And that is the change many caregivers miss because we're looking at the symptoms. And the real change is not the symptom. The real change is the growing dependence underneath the symptom. The missed bill isn't the change. The dependence is the change. The medication mistake isn't the change. The increasing dependence is. The forgotten appointment isn't the change. The dependence is. The repeated confusion isn't the change. The increasing dependence is. And once you can see that, something becomes much clearer. The situation is no longer asking you the same question it asked you 3 years ago, because the requirements of the situation has changed. And this is where many caregivers get stuck, because we keep asking questions that belong to the old situation. How do I remind her better? How do I stay more organized? How do I explain this differently? How do I keep up? Now, please, these are not bad questions, but they may no longer be the most important question, because once the requirements of the situation has changed, a different decision starts to hide underneath this. Let me show you what I mean. When your mom forgot one bill, the decision was simple: help her pay the bill. When she forgot one appointment, the decision was simple: help her remember the appointment. When she made one mistake with her medication, the decision was simple: step in and correct it. But when these things become patterns, the decision changes. The question is no longer, how do I fix this individual problem? The question becomes, who is responsible for making sure this gets done? That is a different question. It is a different decision. And most caregivers don't recognize it because they're solving today's problem. The missed bill becomes a financial issue. The medication issue becomes a hospitalization. The appointment becomes a scheduling problem. The confusion becomes a memory issue. But underneath all of them is the same question: who is responsible now? Because if your loved one can no longer reliably carry that responsibility themselves, someone else is doing it. The only question is whether it's been recognized yet. And that is where perspective is lost. The caregiver continues acting as if they're helping another person, when in reality, you might have become responsible for the functions that the other person can no longer manage. Not because they don't want to, not because they didn't plan for it, but because the situation has changed. And once you can see that, another question naturally follows. If responsibility has moved, does the current caregiving structure still make sense? Can one person continue carrying all of this? Are the right people involved? Does the authority match the responsibility? Does the level of support match the level of need? These are decisions that start to appear once you recognize what has changed. And until these decisions are recognized, most caregivers continue doing more and more and wonder why things keep working less and less. Now, let's finish with Christian stewardship, because this is where our Christian caregiving sometimes becomes confusing. We often believe faithfulness means continuing to do what we've always done, continuing to carry what we've carried, continuing to respond the way we've always responded. But that's not actually what Scripture calls us to do. Scripture calls us to walk in truth, to see things clearly, to exercise wisdom, to steward faithfully what God has placed in front of us. And faithful stewardship becomes recognizing reality, not yesterday's reality, but the reality today. Because faithfulness does not require pretending that our responsibility has changed. Faithfulness does not require pretending. Dependency has not increased. Faithfulness does not require pretending. The requirements of the situation have remained the same. In fact, sometimes the most faithful thing a caregiver can do is acknowledge what has changed. We need to stop arguing with reality. We need to stop comparing today with 5 years ago. We need to stop wishing the situation could return to what it was and instead ask, what is God actually placing in front of me today? What responsibilities has He given me now? What responsibilities are changing? What responsibilities can I no longer carry alone? Or what can I no longer carry for the person I love? Because stewardship starts with seeing clearly. Then comes obedience. Then comes action. You don't need to have a perfect answer today. You don't need a perfect long-term plan. You don't need to solve every future problem. But you do need to stop and recognize and see what has changed. Because until you recognize what has changed, you'll still keep trying to solve today's problems with yesterday's assumptions. And that's one of the quickest ways for us caregivers to lose perspective. Now, let me leave you with this question. Are you still thinking about your situation the way it used to be? Or have you recognized what it is becoming? Because those are not always the same thing. And recognizing the difference might be the most important caregiving decision you can make this year. So, if this sounds familiar, your caregiving situation may have reached a decision. So, if this situation sounds familiar, your caregiving situation might have reached a decision point. I invite you to go to dignacarebydesign.com and look and see if you can find your caregiving situation on the website and see whether it has now reached a decision point. And as I end all of the podcasts, may the Lord bless you and keep you, and I will see you in our next episode.